2020 to order. Can we begin with a roll call, please?
Yes, Chair Tangy.
Here.
Vice Chair Mayer.
Here.
Commissioner Vasade Elcock.
Here.
Commissioner White.
Here.
Commissioner Figueroa.
Here.
And Commissioner Barstow.
Here.
All present except for Commissioner Davies.
Okay, and as we only have one item on our agenda for the evening, and that is strategic infill redevelopment plan discussion. Can we turn it over to staff for a staff report on that, and we'll get rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chair Tagney. I did want to just start by reminding the Commission that this meeting is being recorded for posterity and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel so folks can watch it afterwards. We are still receiving public comment through the PC at cityofarcata.org, and we've noticed that on the agenda, and so I'll check periodically to see if we received any public comment on this item, although unfortunately the public will not be able to view the item simulcast with your actual meeting. I do want to allow for questions during the presentation and also a robust discussion following the leads that you find most of interest. But I do have a short presentation prepared that I'd like to share with you. And so I'll share my screen. Okay, so without further ado, first, just wanted to address the elephant in the room. Obviously, there's a lot of concern and talk about what's going on with HSU in light of the COVID epidemic, as well as in general, what's been going on with the decline in enrollment. I've had people ask me, why are we having a discussion about housing? There seems to be a lot of it. And I guess, the counterpoints that I would make are that, one, HSU is still going to be there. This is a long-range planning effort that we're doing, not designed to track with, every little tick in the market. And also that we anticipate, that future growth regardless of this current crisis that we're in. Also want to understand that as the market is freed up in Arcata, as some people have moved out, what I'm hearing from people, and I don't have data to substantiate this, but what I'm hearing from folks that manage properties is that folks are moving in from out of the area. Just as a point of order, I want to let you know that I've reduced the size of the screen, so don't raise your hand, I won't see it. Go ahead and just jump in and interrupt me. Okay, first I just wanted to acknowledge that the some of this presentation is based on this toolkit to close California's housing gap that was put out by the McKinsey Global Institute, which I did share an advanced copy a few days ago with you. Obviously, it's a large document. I don't expect that you've read it all, but it's an important resource for just framing the issues that we're dealing with statewide, and also a indicator as to what we should be looking at our local market as well. And so I'll use some of the figures from this, and we can reference back to this throughout the presentation. In general, they've characterized, and again, this was a couple years ago, but they characterized housing prices such that half the state's households are unable to afford the cost of housing in their local market. And they identified the economic loss as a result of that gap, and provided several things that both the private industry and city can do to help close that gap. We'll focus in on some of these throughout the presentation. Wanted to identify some of the background information that came out of that report, where they demonstrated a gap between the population that's being added in the state of California versus the housing units that are being added in relative comparison to other states. You can see that the state of California is doing fairly poorly compared to some other states. We did a similar analysis when we did our housing presentations. On the left of the screen, you see the statewide housing need with expected production. And this is out of a more recent estimate, actually, and that they think we'll need 1.8 million units by 2025. In Arcata, the housing production versus needs since 2003, if we're just looking at our regional housing needs allocation, we're at about 70% production. And so there's a gap in the state, and we're reflected a gap in the city of Arcata as well. We went over this with the housing element, but part of this is to remind you and where we started from with the housing element analysis, and also to refresh our memory on what we said we would do in that analysis. In this regional housing needs allocation cycle, which is an 8-year cycle, we're required to produce 610 units total. We believe that through the build out of all the existing vacant, go ahead. I thought there was a question. Build out of all the existing vacant lots, we could have 230 units produced. We believe we could produce about 80 ADUs in that time frame. That's 10 per year, which is a very conservative estimate. And the Creekside project, which we were estimating before it was adopted, we were anticipating adoption to produce 89 units in this 8-year period. Those 89 units have now been approved, or they're on their way to approval, which leaves a gap of 211 units. Recall that the 211 units are split between affordable units to persons of very low income and low income. And so these aren't just 210 units in total. We actually have to fit them into certain categories. And the state in the recent housing element cycle made the rules such that those units that were counted as affordable had to meet certain criteria. Jennifer Dart, our deputy director, and our consultants went through a lot of hand wringing to try and pull those units out. And so what we ultimately committed to in that housing element was a review of certain areas that were, where we could densify and create higher density housing in rezoned areas. So just a quick recap of those. And again, this is what we adopted in our housing element, that we would look at the downtown area, including the Uniontown Shopping Center. Joe Mateer, our senior planner, has started some of that work with some interns. That idea has been sort of bopping around for some time, and we're actually starting to take a closer look at that. The Craftsmen's Mall, which is an area in the center of town where the Village project was proposed. This whole area that's in the black bar, black highlighting is an area that we'd like to take a look at, that we think we can densify based on that outreach. The Craftsmen's Mall project would be followed by the Valley West Shopping Center, where there's quite a bit of land available. Similar outcomes for the Valley West Shopping Center as for Uniontown, where you have a large parking area. You can densify by going up and not really affecting the adjacent areas. And then lastly, the Arcata Gateway specific plan area, which is kind of along the K Street corridor and the purple or industrial areas that are surrounding that. Again, there were many other ideas within the housing element as to how to achieve our housing goals. And so I don't want to portray that our housing element only focused on high density infill development, but that's the topic for tonight. So that's what we're looking at here.
David?
Yeah.
I have a question, and this has come up a couple of times, and I realized that there were reasons behind it. I noticed that you were looking at mixed-use development in a number of the shopping centers around town. Is there any strong reason why the Sunnybrae shopping center was not included in that. As other areas, it has a lot of parking, and it's basically about 1.5 stories of usable space there.
That's a really good point. I think we were focusing on areas where there's really high bang for the buck, but that doesn't mean that we can't apply these same principles or continue to look. This is just what we've identified to date. So that's
Okay,
a really good
great.
point. I think we should look at that. Several staff members have also mentioned that as an opportunity as well. So I'm, my point here was just to remind us, refresh our memory about what areas we had said that we would look at for, densification and higher density developments. Not necessarily to go into detail in any of these individual areas, but we certainly can if there's a will of the commission to do so. And so we can talk about some of the general opportunities that we see in each of these different areas. I will mention that we had quantified the specific plan area, the Arcata Gateway, a little bit more intensively than we did the other opportunity areas. And in this zone, in particular, from a land use perspective, this region, this purple region, is really a relic of our industrial past. This area was zoned for the uses that were applicable back in the days of logging. We've transitioned a bit from that. This area has use that predated zoning, and it was just historically the way that the city evolved. And we adopted those evolving uses into our zoning ordinances and never took a hard look at what the highest and best use for this property is. I would note, though, that the areas immediately adjacent to this area, are all residential. It's also, just by way of, noting, a stone's throw from the downtown commercial area. We're obviously seeing the transition in that area as the uses have shifted, and the Creamery District is one of the most vibrant, active, community-led districts that we have in the city of Arcata, and we're blessed with many. So I think that really what this plan attempts to do is to acknowledge, that transition and incorporate, a lot higher density, a lot larger scale buildings in an area where you already have some examples and representations of larger scale buildings. This is a particularly ripe opportunity for us, in particular because of the size of the parcels. So, very large building on small parcels, tend to stand out a little bit more than very large buildings on larger parcels. And there's also a lot of redevelopment potential in this area. So the quantification that we have here is that, between that 90 acres, we identified that we would have 99 of our very low income units in this zone, and in total be able to generate somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 units, depending on what our zoning ultimately looks like in that area. Again, I wanted to refresh your memory on what we did with the community to develop some of this work as we were going through the housing element update. And I did present this last time, but I wanted to dig into this table just a little bit more in depth. Basically, what this table shows is the representation of the number of people who had green dots, meaning green for go, and red dots, meaning red for no, into the types of policies that they wanted to see. And yes, it's a scatter. It also gave people the opportunity to, tell us, how strongly they felt about it. Some folks are Midland, but the majority of folks were, strongly in favor or strongly opposed to these ideas. And basically what we see here is in terms of the policies that were around high density development, there was really support for densification in and around the downtown and opposition to annexing lands outside of the city. Now, this was our first housing meeting that we did that was general and open to the public. And I wanted to remind you that from last time, we also did a Spanish language meeting as well. And there were some interesting contrasts. While we saw the desire for higher density development in residential zones and largely encouragement for multi-story apartments near the downtown, there was a shift in annexation, whereas folks in that meeting said, yeah, let's go ahead and annex to provide some more single family housing. And there was a shift in terms of mixed use development in and around commercial areas. Most folks thought that that was the wrong place to focus our attention, and that we should be looking elsewhere. And so there's a lot of agreement in terms of densification in residential zones and multi-story apartments near downtown, but the community still needs to engage and discuss more the idea of mixed-use development around commercial areas, such as the Uniontown and Giantoli Lane projects that are upzones that we talked about. And there's still a discussion around annexations that I think we need to have. Again, back to the McKinsey report. Just wanted to touch base real quick on this very complex table that I'll try and walk you through and simplify. Oops, if I can stay with it. The table looks at both single family and multifamily, broken down into these columns here. Process for the time it took to get approval for the number of units. And so it's kind of a time effect table, if you will, depending on how difficult the process was or how rich the process was, going from no rezoning or general plan amendment to zoning change or general plan, all the way up to EIR with litigation. The duration for single family projects, the average entitlement is shown in this tan column here. And it shows that, for no rezoning or plan amendments, jurisdictions throughout the state typically have approvals within 6 months for single family and 7 months for multifamily. For projects where there's an EIR and there's no litigation, the average entitlement process is 21 months for single family and 15 months for multifamily. So these are interesting to contrast. They also took a look at what that effect was in terms of the economic impact of those projects and what cost savings there could be in scenarios where you would shave some of the time off. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I do want to point out that these basically the cost is significantly less if you can shave off even just a portion of the time it takes to get through the permitting process. And interestingly, I guess there's probably because the majority of the state is building single family housing and not much multifamily is being developed, is my guess as to why there's such a significant cost savings on single family over multifamily. We can dig into that. So, I wanted to reflect on, what does this look like in the city of Arcata? How do these metrics look for us? Both in terms of the time it takes for entitlement, and the overall costs. And I'm having a hard time, frankly, of being able to tease that information out for cost. And we just don't have a whole lot of data points for the time for entitlement. We have some projects, such as the Creekside project, which depending on which iteration of it you want to start with, you can say it took anywhere from approximately 3 years this last time around to 20 years if you want to consider the fact that it was envisioned in the general plan and was was applied for as an annexation within a couple of years of the adoption of the general plan. In terms of the number of continuances for that project, I think I counted a total of maybe 8 hearings. And so we did pretty well in terms of continuances this time around. In total, there were maybe 16 hearings if you include the first time it tried to get entitled. And so that just gives you a relative comparison in terms of statewide or, how process rich our process is. There are few other examples that I can pull from, but I'll keep working on it and try and bring that information forward, because I think it's important to, to be able to make these comparisons. Oftentimes, developers will say that permitting in Arcata is arduous and that they never want to do it. When I looked at some of the approvals that we've done, though, they didn't appear to me to be terribly arduous. The Sunset Terrace project was approved, I think, in 5 meetings total, and took approximately 18 months from the time it was applied for to the time it was approved. And for a project of that scale and size, I mean, that seems fairly reasonable, considering the environmental, that included the entire time it took to do the environmental documents. But I do want to take a closer look at this, because that narrative that Arcata is a difficult place to develop, I want to have facts to be able to respond to that with. And if it turns out that in fact Arcata is a difficult place to develop in, that you have projects like the 30th Street Commons that never got off the ground, the Q Street subdivision that took years and years to get off the ground, the Creekside is an example. They go on and on, teasing apart which of those factors were governmental and which were market, I think is going to be important for this discussion.
David?
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out too that with the new housing element annual reports that we're doing, they are asking us to track that. So going forward, we will be tracking entitlement dates, building permit issuance dates, and then certificates of occupancy. So we'll have a little more data as the time goes along. This is something that's brand new, starting with this next year's housing element report. So I just wanted to point that out, that I know it doesn't give us all of the data, but it will at least give us some points of reference that we can use going forward.
Yeah, really good point. We'll try and match that data with, rearview mirror looking data as well.
I have a question on that one. Is that part of a statewide mandate, and therefore will we be able to compare our data to other cities?
Jen?
Yes, it is. So that's something that's new on any of the, basically starting with 2019, but a lot of people like that, including us, our jurisdiction, didn't have some of that entitlement data. So they're kind of giving us a little pass to get up and running with that. So yes, we'll be able to look at how well we're doing as opposed to how well other jurisdictions. We could probably pull their reports from similar timeframes and see how they're doing as opposed to how we're doing. So yeah, we can compare some of that.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions on any of that so far?
David?
Yes.
You mentioned something about relative cost that isn't on this chart. And I'm not really sure what you had in mind, but if you are looking at relative cost, I suggest that if you're developing some numbers based on Arcata there, I'd like to see cost per housing unit, because yes, it is going to cost more to get 140 unit apartment complex approved than it's going to cost to get 3 single family homes approved. And that is altogether appropriate. And so, I think that Arcata would look particularly good if we looked at that matrix, and I think it would show that Arcata has not been overly costly in terms of approval for multifamily projects.
Yeah, I don't know that I will be able to get that information. I will attempt to, because I do think that's an important piece of this discussion.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm not sure it's all that important to get it, but if you are gonna, go to the effort of getting it, that cost per unit is, I think, the appropriate one to compare rather than cost per project.
Yeah, and I do think that, we'll, if we can get the data, we'll sort through how is best to display it, because, obviously the cost per unit varies greatly as well, depending on how it's provisioned and the target market.
Great.
Okay, we'll look at that though. So, if you had a chance to read through the McKinsey report, you saw that they had 14 different recommendations, grouped into these different categories here. And, the city in its strategic infill redevelopment plan, this sort of umbrella concept planning work that we're doing, we really focused in on, several of these different strategies. And it's good to see that we're tying into the exact same strategies that, that this, this think tank is, just by our own sort of internal, community engagement. But I've circled the areas that the infill plan really is driving towards. This idea of intensifying housing around transit hubs really ties in neatly with the city's alternative transportation goals. And a lot of that is also tied to the fact that our transportation hub is focused around the downtown. Adding units to underutilized urban land zoned for multifamily development. And I loosely translate this into including areas like the Gateway, where there's opportunity for densification. This next one, incentivize local governments to approve already planned for housing. This was a recommendation to the state. And we were sort of, as far as I'm concerned, fairly leading edge when it came to, thinking about how to do this. When the state came out with its SB2 funding a couple of years ago, we were talking with the HCD director then, and, sitting around a table of community development directors being asked, what would you do with this money if you were to receive it? And we were already working on the strategic infill redevelopment plan concept, but I had no idea how we were going to fund it. So of course I leapt out of my seat and I said, I know exactly what we would use it for. Sorry, was there a question or a comment? Accelerating land use approvals, a lot of this is driving towards trying to do the community process now and really specify and fine detail what the community desire is so that we can principally permit these types of development, so that they don't have to go through another one-off planning process, and we can really evaluate as a community how to meet our housing goals, and create a plan that allows developers to come in and invest in ways that the community has already identified as a priority. The state, again, this is a recommendation to the state to prioritize state and local funding for affordable housing. We've certainly done that in the city of Arcata. Jen, do you know the numbers off the top of your head, how many millions of dollars we have into our housing projects to date?
Is it 4? I can find it. Give me a second.
Okay, I think that's right. I think it's somewhere around 4. We'll get a number for you. And then attract new investors in affordable housing. One of the real challenges that we have in creating affordable housing is that, for the most part, our success has really been derived from securing large grants, working with developers to secure tax credits in this modern time when we don't have redevelopment dollars. We go back to the exact same investors who do this type of product time and time again, and we end up with basically 100% affordable housing projects. What we would like, I believe, as a community to do is to move more towards a mixed income model where investment in affordable housing is part and parcel for and desirable for open market investors. And, you know, as well as a range of other, you know, state and local funding mechanisms to make this a reality. So each of these has tied with it a, you know, an implementation measure or a facet within the strategic infill redevelopment plan that we'll be developing and bringing to, you know, Planning Commission and the public to discuss how to really affect this change.
Could I ask a quick question, David?
Please.
Going back to attracting new investors and doing a mixed income model, we don't really have anything like that currently in Arcata. Is that correct?
There are a few projects where there's mixed income. Most of them are single family, first-time homebuyer projects that we accomplished with the redevelopment agency, the former redevelopment agency, funding those projects. We used to have an inclusionary zoning requirement. So if you created a certain number of units, you would have to provide a certain proportion of those units as affordable. But the city was funding all of that work. And when redevelopment was dissolved, we also removed that requirement. What I'd like to see in some of these planning efforts is to hit a midpoint between inclusionary zoning, which requires affordable housing to be created, and where we're at now, where we just have no leverage to ask for affordable housing and market rate projects, and use our infill plan to strongly encourage, to make creating affordable housing desirable for those developers, those private market developers. Obviously, you know, the time it takes to construction, this was part of the time, money, uncertainty triangle that we talked about last time, the development triangle. If you remove the time that it takes for development, then that reduces the cost. One of the outcomes that I'm hopeful that this strategic infill redevelopment plan will garner is a process whereby we've already identified the community amenities that we would like to see. Most developers I've spoken with say that they're more than happy to, you know, contribute to the community good, whether it's through, you know, conditions of approval where they create, you know, some community asset, or, you know, if it's, you know, contributing to a fund to create those assets. But what winds up happening through the development process is that all of the holding costs, all of the time it takes, you know, all of the studies they have to do, all of the, you know, committee meetings and so on and so forth, creates a scenario where, you know, they can't, you know, projects become infeasible. So if we've pre-identified a set of amenities, you know, a set of trails, a set of, you know, alternative transportation metrics, et cetera, that we'd like to see in this community. And we told the developer, tell you what, day one, when you come in with your project, you're getting approved, but we need you to contribute to this community asset. Most of them, I think, would be agreeable to that. So time is an important factor for development. And that time.
I'm sorry, can I ask another question? I just wanted to go back to Tool 6 with the incentivization for local government to approve already planned for housing. So we talked about where you were at, I guess, a forum where they were talking about that, and we did have plans. It was SB, help me out with the particular funding that was available at that time.
SB2.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Are there other things that have been identified, or that we can reach out and try to utilize those so that there is more opportunities?
To help with the developing the plans or for assisting with individual projects?
I guess I was thinking of more assisting with individual projects so that these developers, you know, would be less on them. So we would incentivize them through these other programs that are out there so that it is feasible for them and it doesn't look like, oh, we don't want to do that. Arcata is just too much.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I, continue to tell anyone who will let me tell them, at the state level, is that we need more flexibility in some of these funding sources. Many of the funding sources are really complex to begin with to get a 100% affordable housing project to market. And it vastly complicates the project and the process when you incorporate a open market component to it. And so, we tell our reps at HCD, we tell the management at HCD, we tell our folks representing us at the state level as well, that we just absolutely need more flexibility with those funds. So we'll continue to pursue those opportunities. The city has been very successful at securing grants to do projects. And so we will, continue to do that and continue to try and build our own local resources to have that flexibility. But you're right. I mean, a private market deal where they're considering taking on affordable housing, it gets really complex. They're used to building it and then leasing it. They don't want to look at our regulatory agreements, and talk through all the process that's involved in that. So we do need to make that affordable housing component very simple for those open market investors. The last thing on here that we're really trying to incorporate into the strategic infill redevelopment plan is to align development impact fees with housing objectives. And this is more specifically what I was just referring to, where we have an impact fee because we know we want trails. Instead of putting a project through a series of committees and have them say, we'd like you to build a trail, we already know we want trails. Let's just say, give us money for a trail. We have a program, it's called the Trail Program. You're gonna contribute to it to build in Arcata. Eliminate the uncertainty of going through a planning process. We know what we want and the outcomes that we need, and we know what they cost. So you'll pay a fair share of that. So these are kind of the priority areas that staff has recommended that we focus on. We've continued to get, as we've come back through these study sessions over the years, we've continued to get encouragement from the decision makers to, to continue on this pathway. Part of what this presentation is about is, bringing the new folks up to speed, and with where we've been at, and also to just have a refresher for everyone else.
One more quick question before we move on. Tool number 3, we're not focusing on adding additional units so much then on single units, like adding an ADU, with the new state laws allowing less, what am I looking for here? Less regulations. I mean, they still need to go through the process, but now people can add an additional mother-in-law unit or a junior unit, but that's just not enough for us to really, those numbers aren't that big or great. I'm just wondering why we're not looking at that as a possible solution for additional housing.
That is part of the objective, and we did anticipate that we would get at least 80 units, 10 units per year. And again, that's a conservative estimate for second units. And the state has, actually made it so that properties can have third units if they do what's called a junior ADU. We did discuss that before. And again, there are a couple of other implementation measures that will also get at our housing quantity. It's just that for tonight's meeting, we wanted to focus on the strategic infill redevelopment plan. And so that's happening in concert with these other ideas like having second units and third units added to the housing stock. Jen, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight that that is actually an implementation measure in our housing element. So it's implementation measure 13. And it's something that we stated that we would do by June 30th, 2021, is updating our zoning code to comply with the most updated ADU regulations. So that is something that we're going to be working on. And I did want to mention too that last year, so the 2019 report, it looks like we did about 16 ADUs that were permitted during that time frame. So we're exceeding what we had said. We estimated about 10 a year, but it looks like we're doing a few more than that. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes. You know, Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add about, you know, the second units.
What were you looking for? Certainly, you know, Arcata's always promoted accessory dwelling units, and I think you know, what I'm working through right now is a building permit review and trying to basically look at the city zoning code and what we've always kind of anticipated and allowed with traditionally is called secondary dwelling units versus now what they call accessory dwelling units, and the new state law as well. So there are provisions that allow development to occur that give property owners certain advantages through the state law implementation. But, you know, sometimes it is pretty convoluted process trying to fit that round peg in a square hole. And, you know, we're trying to really balance some of those objectives, not only of the cities for providing additional housing, but also the state. And so, you know, we do appreciate what the state is doing, but again, sometimes it's almost too much, and it's not allowing that flexibility that the director mentioned earlier with other aspects of housing.
A question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, and this may be one of those things that you're going to just say, don't ask, don't tell. But for the rather large number of unpermitted accessory dwellings that can now actually be legalized under the new ADU rules, are we actually going to count those as new units in terms of meeting our RENA requirements and the general plan housing element goals?
So simple question with a probably too complex answer, but I'll give the short answer first. I think the answer to how do we get those units verified is something that we need to work with the building and engineering department on. Whether it's a good policy decision to do that, I think the answer is yes. Whether we get credit for those, I actually don't know. Jen, do you have information on whether we can count existing units unpermitted?
I do. If it's an unpermitted unit, it's not an existing unit and it's never been counted before. So if it becomes permitted during the time frame, it can be counted. And we did at least count one last year. And Joe Bishop and I actually had to do a little research on that one to find out if we could count it. But yes, they can be counted and come into compliance last year.
Okay, thank you very much.
David?
Yes.
Hi, I just have a question. So it seems like we're very, really encouraging, the city's really encouraging this high density, and I understand why. But the reality is all the reports in this infill study shows that what the public really wants, people really want, mostly is a single family home or an apartment, but mostly a single family home. What are we doing to encourage the building of single family homes? Why aren't we giving the public what they want?
I think that well, there's a couple of things in there. I mean, I think that the public is obviously all over the map is what it boils down to, is that there's enough people who want all of the different options that we're looking at. And I guess just going back to the tables here, what it appears to me anyway, and this is just from one meeting. This doesn't encompass all of the outreach that we did, and it doesn't encompass all of the outreach we will continue to do. But it appears to me that there is pretty strong support for these higher density developments, and so both in the English meeting that we had and in the Spanish meeting we had, folks do absolutely want single family housing stock. And I think one of the one of the theories that we're trying to test with this is whether or not creating enough units that are the right types will start to satiate the rental market, and have some of that rental market that's currently in single family housing stock that's currently in rental transition over to home ownership. We definitely have the need to produce all different types of housing, and some opportunities are easier than other opportunities. We did just approve the Creekside Homes project that has substantial component of new single family homes in it. There are several projects throughout town that will have single family homes built. But I think that just looking at the land base in the city, we really have the biggest opportunity for multifamily housing, for high density housing. And that's in part why the focus is on that. And again, I think this falls back into the category that, tonight's meeting is really designed to, discuss and push the ball forward on the strategic infill redevelopment plan. And it's not that that's to the exclusion of other housing types that we want to continue to promote and support in the city.
David, might I ask, is also part of the challenge that we need to meet our RENA numbers? And it's hard to imagine doing it if we were focused mostly on single family homes.
Yeah, that's absolutely a part of it too. The city does have, available land immediately adjacent to the west, that is developable. It's, certainly within the realm of possibility that we could annex those areas and create more single family subdivisions. It's just currently, in order to do that, we'd have to do other, general plan amendments to, to bake that into our planning process and make it consistent with our existing planning documents. So,
if I may discuss some of the other implementations that the state is trying to do with housing and land use activities, is linking it to climate change, greenhouse gases, and vehicle miles traveled. So I think that the strategic infill development plan will assist the city in placing housing near our commercial zones, our employment zones, and assisting with all those sustainable community goals that the state has as well, as not only just providing housing, but providing smart housing as well.
Julie, did you, I'm sorry, Commissioner Besaid-Elcock, did you have a follow-up question?
I just had probably a really dumb question, but I can't help it. So the certificate of occupancy, when that is given, that's how the state counts our housing, right?
That's correct.
No,
No.
actually, it's not. They
Go
count
ahead,
the
tell me.
housing, they count the housing when the building permit is issued, not
Okay.
when the certificate of occupancy is finalized, although they are now tracking those certificates of occupancy as well, because what they're realizing is that even though they count when the building permit's issued, that doesn't necessarily mean that that housing was actually created. And so now on our new reports, we're providing them not only information on the building permits issued, but also the certificates of occupancy. And so we might be tracking data for 2 or 3 years, depending on how long these projects go. So I have to keep track of that information, which is a little tricky. But yeah, the way that they look at it is actually permit issued is when that gets.
So just to kind of bring those two statements together, we report on and get credit on our RENA for meeting our RENA when the building permit is issued. And in fact, at the beginning of a cycle, at the end of a cycle, there's actually a little bit of double counting that goes on. And we can get into that detail if you're interested. But we don't formally, we can lose that credit if the certificate of occupancy, is not formally issued. And so we, as Jen said, we have to, keep track of both. But we do get initial credit as soon as the building permit's issued.
So how do single family occupant, not single family, say if you were renting out a room in your home, how does that get reported? How is that counted?
It's
Is
not.
it not? Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, we don't get credit for that. But if you did create a junior ADU, took a room in your home, gave it a second, access point, independent access point, and provided some amenities for sanitation and cooking, we would get credit for that.
Okay.
I've got a question. So in regards to question number 5, what if we change the question from being new subdivisions of single family homes to multifamily homes, and seeing how that relates to the public and how they feel regarding developing multifamily homes within, annexed areas versus just single family homes?
We can certainly explore that. I think that, again, it runs a little counter to the modern principles for land use. It kind of runs counter to the direction I think that the state would see us go. But there's certainly no reason why you couldn't have much higher density development outside of the city. In a way, greenfield expansion or annexation of new undeveloped lands outside of your city boundaries is one of the simplest ways in terms of public process, because you don't have a lot of neighbors, and so the density of protest coming to those greenfield projects is much lower. One of the reports that we'll be bringing in the next month or so is our market analysis report. Again, I told you at our last meeting that we wanted to get past just the narrative, just the stories we keep telling ourselves around the campfire about what our housing market looks like, and really wanted to dig into data and feasibility analyses and try and discuss whether or not it's cost effective to do that greenfield annexation or do infill development, and use that as a basis for the real facts as a basis for making these decisions. And so I think we'll have a little bit more robust conversation around that when the time comes. And in part, I think we didn't want to ask a question like that. It would have been a little bit misleading. I mean, we certainly allowed for people to express their opinions about whatever other options they wanted to, not on this slide, but on another slide in this meeting. But it would have been a little misleading for the city to bring forward options that we just don't think are, as the staff don't think are supportable. So. So, at the end of the day, what this infill program is intended to do is to, provide high density housing that kind of ticks off most of the objectives the city has for, affordable housing, housing for different age groups, folks, the alternative transportation goals that we have, so on and so forth, but that is streamlined in a way that, allows the developers a low cost of entry to provide us exactly what it is that we've said as a community that we want in order to meet those statewide housing objectives. So I wanted to update you real quick.
David, quick question on that last slide. Can you
Sure.
tell me what form-based means?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. A form-based code is one that describes the, essentially what the development should look like, as opposed to getting into great detail about what the uses are that go on inside that building. And so form-based code says, we want, this big a setback, we want this scale of development, we want them to be articulated like this, we want, this general thematic pattern, so that you have a form that you can rely on as opposed to a use type, and then having a design review process. So we'll basically take, and this, this would be impossible to do citywide, but we'll take sections in the city, and so in the specific plan area along the K Street corridor, for example, we can get into that region and say, at least on the K Street corridor, here's the form of the buildings. This is how these buildings interact with the public space. And then you largely have free license to do what you want to do within those buildings. So it's less a land use based code and more a design based code. Yeah, thanks for asking. Sorry, I didn't clarify. I wanted to update you real quick on where we're at with funding this effort. The effort includes, along the top row here, the effort includes a market study, which we contracted with AED to do, and we're near completion on that. It includes a lot of public engagement, some of which we've contracted for. That includes the housing element, the specific plan that I've been talking with you about, general plan amendments. Again, we're not planning on completely throwing out our general plan, but certainly freshening it up. And then it also includes the environmental impact report in order to implement all of this. I don't have a specific price tag since we haven't gone out for the RFPs for all this work, but I'm thinking that, at our sum total of 1.3 million, we're getting close to being able to fund this project. A couple of years ago, we started with a dream and a little bit of local funds in our general plan update trust account. We've grown that trust account, but we've also secured $100,000 from CDBG, some SB2 money that we're going after, additional general plan update money that we get from projects that are done within the city of Arcata. They pay a small fee when they get permitted, and that money gets stored up to make these updates. The Creekside had a $130,000 condition of approval that they contribute to this effort. Sorry about that. Let's try this one again. See the
David,
slide in fast motion. Yeah.
for the record, I just wanted to say it's actually ADE. It's Applied Development Economics, who has the market study.
Okay, thanks for that.
Since this is going to be recorded. Just wanted to give them a ring.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The LCP grant that we have with the Coastal Commission is contributing to a portion of it. About probably 60% of the area that's in the Gateway plan is is in the coastal zone. So we're using some of that funding to help with this effort. In addition, we were awarded the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Commission grant, $250,000, and then we've got some matching in kind. We still have some unidentified resources. I'm guessing around $400,000 that we'll still need to complete these documents, but we're still steadily marching our way towards being able to fund this project. And the objective is to get this completed by sometime in early to mid 2021. And I'll have to apologize to our contractor for getting their name wrong there. It's been floating around in this table for months. I don't know how we didn't see it before. So that's really all I have prepared. I don't know if you wanted to dig into the detail and a lot more, any more about some of the specific objectives, or you have leads that you'd like us to chase down, or information you'd like us to bring back that we can talk about.
I was wondering if I might digress back to some of the tools that we maybe are not particularly focusing on. I was just wondering why we're not doing any kind of modular deployment. I know that it seems to me that could address, I don't know if that would include like housing or tiny houses, and whether that would help with some of affordable housing that we lack in. I'm looking at what was it, over 50% of very low income people were spending over 37% of their income on housing, and just thinking about those people and how we might be able to bring it closer to 30%, which is where we should be, as opposed to what is it called, overpayment, I believe is what that's referred to with regards to housing margin. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on a I just was wondering, we did talk a little bit about tiny other places that we might be able to address affordable. I'm just wondering what, I'll be quiet.
I do think that the, tiny homes, if you will, or other ADUs, simple accessory dwelling units, are a viable option, in particular for, neighborhood infill where you have existing, existing housing. The city had, made a tactical decision, early on to not trying to emphasize tiny homes on vacant lots, as a way to try and, close the housing gap, simply because we don't have very many vacant lots left, and we would not be able to achieve the kinds of densities that you would need to meet our regional housing needs goals and the community need. So I definitely think there's a role for very small accommodations, whether they're in apartment complexes or, or on, on single family parcels, for example, where you can add an ADU. And that's, this concept of, affordable by design, where essentially you've created a very small unit, you don't have a large footprint, there's not a lot of extra there. And as a result, in theory, the rents that type of housing would fetch would be more affordable. And I do think that there's a role for that kind of housing in our housing market. And again, the only reason why we didn't, dig into some of those details tonight was because we were looking more at the higher density infill, but that's certainly an infill strategy.
So I'm wondering, does Sandpiper fall under the affordable by design? They were going at one point at the beginning at 67,000 for a unit, and they were small. And it seemed like there was, they put them in that tiny little trailer park at one point. I'm not quite sure how many units, but that seemed like that was a really good use of land, met some affordable housing needs and ownership as well.
Yeah, the city participated in that project financially to assist the development of those for affordable housing. And so there are actually affordability restrictions on the units and a requirement that they be let to, sold to, folks that there are a couple of moderate income, but most of them are lower income. And I guess, that's a good, contrast point, because I believe there are 18 units, if I can get someone to confirm that, on that project. Jen, did you have a confirmation or a correction?
Nope, there are 18 units on there, and it's actually, we've identified it as implementation measure 3, which is affordable housing preservation. And so it wouldn't necessarily be tiny homes that would be individual. We considered it more like a mobile home park program. And so we identified that as we would like to build on that successful program. And I did want to point out that we did receive HEAP funding, which we're trying to work through, which would add basically 4 to 5 units at Arcata Mobile Home Park, which ROP is the owner of that same mobile home park. And so we are trying to work with what we can do there as far as the mobile home side. But Sandpiper is considered a mobile home park, so it's a little different than like an individual tiny home, but it's very similar. I mean, they are, I guess I would personally consider them tiny homes, but I just wanted to say that implementation measure 3 is probably where that is found.
Yeah, and I guess, close the loop on the contrast between the number of units that could be, on that site. If it was a higher density, those 18 units, are kind of spread out on the site. But even if you just said that, well, we're going to consolidate those into a building and then make it 4 stories, you could have 4 times 18. And if you included, some affordability restrictions inside of that, you might end up with the same, same outcome for affordable units. That particular location probably wouldn't be ideal for a 4-story building, but I'm just saying, for a thought experiment.
Yeah, in the McKinsey report, they were talking about a 115 affordable modular project that was developed by Bridge, and I didn't get a chance to look into that project itself, but it seemed like a way that, yeah, I guess it would still meet the affordable housing, but get more units in a smaller space. Definitely wouldn't want to go upward by the marsh places, so.
Yeah. I think too, the McKinsey report was looking at, modular development, so that even if you had a multi-story project, the construction technique would be to build those units off-site and then bring them and assemble them to the site as a cost savings and time savings.
Right.
Our area is somewhat challenged because we don't have the volume of development, but I'd love to see a project like that happen.
I'm not quite sure how we would get them through the windy mountains, like through, the Avenue of Giants and modulars, but yeah.
I think that those projects actually have worked really well for places that have like, that are more rural but have land base. So they have like a lot of spread out area. We met with, I can't remember, David, do you remember who we met with that was doing that similar project? Sophia brought them up here for the homelessness group that we met with throughout the state. I can't remember the name of the jurisdiction, but they had a pretty successful program for that, but they had a lot of land. So.
Thanks.
I do not have any other materials prepared, but would be happy to, dig into the report. I've got it available if you have questions about the report. I have our housing element available. If you wanted to dig into any of the implementation measures in there, had questions.
So you say, David, that this infill development plan's going to be ready in 21?
That's the dream.
Okay. And then it will get folded into the general plan somehow, is that correct?
Part of the, the objective, the strategic infill redevelopment plan is really a concept that includes general plan amendments as well as some of these other documents that these long range planning documents. And so, yeah, the general plan will need to be updated. There are several elements that are, ancient. Our recreation element is from like 1989. There are several elements that need to be updated to become consistent with this, this new planning world scenario we're dealing with. And then there are various facets of the general plan that, I think we just need to, take a second look at. But for the most part, the general plan, most of the elements are, I think still fairly reflective. Most people who would read it would say it's still fairly reflective of the city of Arcata. We also need to incorporate the new requirements from the state for safety elements as well. And so I do see, fairly substantial, but not comprehensive update to our general plan.
So a follow-up question on that is things like the goal of creating the Arcata Gateway project and rezoning with a lot of infill goals. Is progress on that going to wait until this strategic infill development plan is complete?
It'll be happening simultaneously. Ultimately, the plans will have to be compatible with one another. But the way that a specific area plan works is that it really identifies and consolidates the policy that's specific to that area. So you might have a policy about, redwood tree preservation, for example. There are no redwood trees or none worth preserving in any case in that specific area plan that we've outlined around the K Street corridor. And so we would, remove that, if you will. We would distill down only those policies that are relevant to that area. And so I think as we go through this process, it'll be a tandem process. We'll be identifying aspects around the general plan that need to be updated or eliminated at the same time as we're reviewing which really pertain to that area and how do we distill down and make more make stronger that policy through this implementation in that specific area.
David, I'm wondering, it sounds like all of these processes are pretty well intertwined, and I know that some of them are going to be on a very different kind of sequence schedule than others. I'm wondering, are you planning to tier all of these off of some kind of general plan update process, or is each one of these going to be subject to CEQA independently, and how does that all fit in with the local coastal program? Because I'm sort of anticipating a bunch of processes operating in tandem using similar data sets and a similar set of assumptions, but then running into some very complicated CEQA issues unless you can describe them to us upfront.
Yeah, the sequencing is going to be important. And, certainly there are, a number of, environmental issues that we're going to have to take into consideration, and they do tie to one another. They do tier from one another. I guess at this point, what I'm hoping that we will be able to do is to have a CEQA document that has a project description that includes the general plan amendments, as well as the specific area plan. And so we've identified, both of those actions within that one analysis. The LCP is, the update to the LCP, it's a little bit of a Venn diagram. There's some overlap, but not 100% overlap. And I'm not exactly sure how, that the timing and the CEQA analysis will overlap. But what I'm anticipating is that we will ultimately adopt into our LCP the work that we've done for these other planning documents, specific area plan and the general plan update. And if the LCP winds up going first, there'll be a environmental analysis that doesn't dig into all of the detail that's going to be into the other documents, but just addresses some of the higher level, planning work that we'll do in the LCP.
So it sounds like the timeline on the LCP is being pushed back yet again. Is that correct?
We are still trying to meet the adoption of our LCP by the end of this year. COVID has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into, our outreach and engagement associated with that, which I think is still a very important part. We want to make sure that we're able to effectively engage the public. So I wouldn't say, I still have the objective to do our LCP update, the comprehensive LCP update by the end of this year. There may be additional amendments that are required once we've completed the other planning work into the LCP.
Thanks.
Well, are there other comments, questions, hopes, dreams, desires?
Got a lot on your plate.
So between now and the 25th, we'll be doing a joint session following this. Is there something that we might do to further prepare for that?
Yeah, the joint study session is on the 25th. I don't have in front of me the list of topics, but this was certainly one of them. I would say that the digging your teeth into the McKinsey report would be a good idea. Reviewing to the extent that you can the information that we have out and available for these study sessions we've done previously would be a really good idea as well.
That McKinsey report is fascinating. I mean, it sure does seem to back up a lot of the discussion that we've had around the infill goals in the city of Arcata and the RENA expectations. And it was a nice, concise package of all the same theory and everything.
Yeah, it's I couldn't agree with you more. It's encouraging to see that we're sort of on a similar track to what's being recommended at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
David, you had mentioned previous study session information. Is that available, to myself, for instance, since this is the first study session I've been involved in?
Yeah, I will try and pull together some of the information for you that we've had that's gone before this. One of the earlier planning commission meetings, we went into some of the state law, and this was during the adoption of the housing element, and that'll be a good reference point for you. So I'll pull together some resources and email them out.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Another question. I don't know exactly how this will come up in our joint study session or later on. I would really like to know how the current budget expectations in Arcata are going to affect all of these different planning initiatives in particular. The city council discussions have really been focusing on basic services. Maybe because the feeling that the need is so immediate there has been prevalent, but obviously some of the planning goals and tasks are going to be affected too. So it would be great if we could maybe address that elephant in that room as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I'm going back to this slide just real quick to take a quick look at, you know, the funding sources. You know, fortunately, the majority of this work that we're proposing is, you know, there we go, is grant funded. And so we are in a pretty significant budget crunch right now. The closure, business closure, and the shelter-in-place order has significantly affected, you know, sales tax in particular, and it's you know, affecting businesses. You know, we're seeing businesses close left and right, and so it's going to have, you know, a staggered and ongoing effect. But that effect, I don't think, is going to impact this work. You know, since the majority of it is grant funded.
Okay.
David, do you need anything else from us? Final questions, final comments? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, if you have anything else to add, if there are, you know, lines of inquiry you'd like us to track down, or information that you know, piqued your interest tonight that you'd like us to focus on more, certainly happy to take down a list and do our best to try and address your questions.
Could we get access to your presentation that you had tonight?
Yeah, I've recorded the presentation, which is not typical for study sessions, but we had unintentionally noticed the public that we would record it. And so we've recorded it, and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel. We did offer that folks could participate by sending in their questions to the PC at City of Arcata. So let me see if I've got any comments. It doesn't look like we've received any comments.
So I was talking in particular the slide presentation that you had put together. Would that be also something we
Oh, I'm
could?
sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, I can make the slide presentation available, and certainly through the recorded session, you can go back and listen to the presentation as well. My slides don't tend to have a lot of words on them, so they're kind of like, well, what's he talking about?
Anybody else? Last questions, comments?
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
We adjourn. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Good night, Joe. Good night, Jennifer, everybody.